So, the first question, how have you been shamed because of who you are or what you believe?
There is, um, yeah, so shame comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Um, it can be something that comes directly at us in a comment or a specific moment, or it can come from a lifetime of just inherently becoming to believe something. In my case, my evangelical Christian faith um, taught me that my concepts of gender, in particular, um, and the specific gender roles that were expected of me, and the ways that I did or did not live up to that were sources of shame, were sources of less than, and I think that's really my understanding of shame is anything that makes me or makes someone else less than they are, less than they were created to be. And whether it was about sexuality or gender or um, economic success or leadership in the church or um, all sorts of spaces um, in general to greater than and less than. And Western Christianity has, for the most part, doubled down on a lot of those. So the concept of shame within the context of the Christian church is easy to accomplish. And when you add things, say again, almost too easy and almost necessary. Uh, for someone to be exalted and um, honored to the place of having what evangelical Christianity would consider salvation, someone else has to be not. There has to be an in and out. And when you create that in and out, someone gets shamed. Now, if that person doesn't want in, then it's not an issue. If it's somebody outside wanting in, then shame will probably ultimately be a deterrent. But the real damage comes when somebody is already in and they're growing into an awareness of themselves and into an ideology that stands in contrast to the established norms. And then shame hits um, like a thunderbolt.
Yeah. What you're saying here, I agree with you, but it sounds like you're saying shame is necessary for the hierarchy to stay in place, for the privilege to stay on top, for the minorities to play a role so that others feel comfortable.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And and shame is masked by aspiration. So we should aspire to be XYZ. We should aspire to be the Proverbs 31 woman or the husband of Corinthians or whatever the standard that we set out there. It's something to aspire to, and anything less than that, or any desire less than that, or much less any deviation from that, is cause for shame within that context.
What do you feel like as you were kind of growing up in that context, what were you aspiring to be?
I was aspiring to be a pastor.
Okay.
I was aspiring to be a godly husband, to be the head of my household. And ironically, I was in a marriage where she had incredible strengths of leadership and direction, and but because of this complementarian paradigm that we were in, neither one of us were free to pursue our strengths. I was the nurturing parent. She was the stronger more vocal leader in certain capacities in our context. And so it would have been beautiful to have the freedom to say, you be you and let me be me. And not only you be you and but celebrate, empower each other to operate in those gifts and those strengths. But instead, shame pushed us to a position of operating outside of our strengths.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And, yeah, so in the context of, and not only that, then that bled over into my work in the church, because my marriage was constantly under scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And was I truly the head of my household, and were my children behaving in a way that conformed to the church? And when my oldest came out as bisexual, how did that reflect on me as a parent and what I was teaching? And and I owned all of those issues. I exasperated the shame in my own world because I wasn't willing to let go of the paradigms.
Sure. Well, this might sound odd, but when we participate with shame, it's a way of belonging. I belong because I conform, and I conform because of the shame.
Yes, and suffering and martyrdom is honored.
Yes.
If I can live and embrace my shame, I would probably call it a false humility. That I am humbled because of the shame, and yet the shame only exists because I have been humbled by a system.
Right.
So,
How do you think that LGBTQ plus Christians could be supportive in this area of helping people in contexts like the one you grew up in overcome shame?
yeah, affirmation is an elixir.
Uh-huh.
I didn't break out of it fully until well, I can tell you exactly when it was. It was actually here in Dayton, and I was sitting with our friend Rachel L. Evans, who lives here in town, and she was the first affirming Christian that I sat with.
Uh-huh.
And she just looked at me and she's like, you know you're still a good Christian, and you need to talk with these people. And she connected me, not only told me to read a book, but actually connected me. She said, you need to read God and the Gay Christian. Here's Matthew Vine's connection. Talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
Find out what they're doing. She said, no matter what you're doing the first week of January every year, and no matter where it is, get to the Gay Christian Network conference, now the QCF conference, and find that space. And that was 3 years ago in April. And her affirmations are what gave me permission to start to set the shame aside. And then as I connected with the groups of mama bears, as I was dealing with my own parenting of LGBTQ kids, and as I connected with QCF and with the Reformation Project and with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship and other affirming spaces, affirmation became the healing source. I had a therapist once tell me that I had an ego problem throughout my days in the church, and I looked at her and almost fired her on the spot because I thought that was really ridiculous. But her inflated ego, she says, you have no ego. You have no sense of self. And the sense of self that I was portraying was the one that would minimize shame.
Mm-hmm.
The masks that I was putting out there were created to let me fit in a way that was as shameless as possible. And what these affirming spaces did was they gave me permission to take the masks off, to shatter the masks, if we want to plug the book. But to go through that process of being genuinely me, and that could never have happened if there weren't people around me saying this is good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, as I'm listening to you, it almost sounds like in the Christian space, losing your identity was healthy. And of course, that's an unhealthy thing, but it's almost like shutting down the image of God that you bear makes you a better Christian in that context,
Yes,
which is so
absolutely.
backwards.
Absolutely. And the reason is because the whole function of religion in many cases is to create God in our own image. And when we've done that, we do so at the expense of any other expression of God's creativity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so opening our hearts and minds to the fact that God is infinitely creative, and that creativity expressed in who we are as people, not just even a diversity of people, but a diversity within ourselves as a person. A complexity that we have to be willing to embrace.
Absolutely. And that's scary for a lot of people to embrace that full spectrum of diversity. It's scary.
It is, because we don't know it, and we can't control what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And the greatest fear isn't in, I believe the greatest fear isn't in not being able to control it, but in ultimately being controlled by it.
Mm-hmm.
That if we know things, and we can prevent them from taking over our world.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And you know, and the more when I see headlines, when I see you know, the responses right now to Pete Buttigieg and his candidacy, and you know, even hearing some objections to LGBTQ inclusion at our seminary and some spaces around that, the fear is takeover, and that this ideology is going to replace a different one or an old one, and there's not a lot of space to exist side by side in that community, which is unfortunate, because creation has been doing it since the dawn of time. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to kind of back up a little bit, not only
Sure.
the affirmation, but it also seems like the community itself was really helpful from other LGBTQ Christians to overcome that shame.
It is. And you know, community to me is kind of like iron. Um, I had a sweatshirt that I made for a CrossFit gym that I worked with, and
Uh-huh.
or worked out in, and did marketing for them for a while. But the shirt actually used the proverb, "Iron sharpens iron. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another." And I was standing in the line at a Walmart there in Texas, and um, a guy all of a sudden says, "You know, it's only true in a blacksmith shop."
Mm-hmm.
And I had to think about my shirt for a second, get myself in context to what he was saying. But I was like, okay, explain that. He's like, well, if you take a sword into battle, since Game of Thrones just released, we'll go with a lovely battle sequence here. But if you take a sword into battle and you're banging swords against each other, iron is not going to sharpen iron. It's going to nick it and dull it, and eventually make it useless. But if you take that iron into a blacksmith shop, and he takes an iron hammer and carefully placed heat, and he hammers that sword knowingly, intentionally into something that is useful, then iron on iron is productive. In the same sense, I think community. I had community.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
In the church, and that's what we talked about. Shame was what was required in order to maintain that community.
Mm-hmm.
So community in and of itself is good and healthy, but the context of that community and how that community is responding to each other. And so to be in a church is good. To be in an affirming church
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is where that lack of shame started to really manifest itself in my life. And so absolutely, community in general is wonderful, but it has to be intentional.
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
it has to be done with great purpose and great care on
Yeah.
all parts.
And safety.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Safety is, of course, it means so many different things in many different contexts, but to have a sense of safety where we can explore,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we can kind of test out ideas about who we are. I have friends that have been with me since very early in this journey,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, I'm going to have lunch with them as soon as we're done here. But she will be more than happy to tell you of all the moments that I have started to step down a road, and they've watched and just kind of given me, "Oh no, honey," kind of, "You go do you, and we're here for it, whatever." But and just to, just to, whether it's a hairstyle or um, a pair of shoes of mine that she just absolutely can't stand. I mean, whatever the expression is,
Uh-huh.
there's room for it and there's space for it, and it doesn't ultimately define us. We have safety in that, and obviously in the context of who we love and how we relate to people and how we express ourselves, and our faith is so much more personal than a hairstyle or our choice of shoes. But the same principles apply. That we need to have the freedom, and we don't have freedom without that safety that you're talking about.
Right. As you look back, has any of the shame been redeemed? Are you glad that you walked down that path?
Yeah, I don't. As much hurt as I've had in my life, and just to put it in context, I didn't come out until I was 42. And that was 5 years ago, and there was at least a year um, of struggle and silence, and um, that just kept manifesting there. So I am who I am because of the journey. I can have these conversations because of what I've experienced. I know shame and can relate to shame deeply because of what I've experienced in shame. And so, while I would never wish what I've been through on anyone, in some capacity, I don't have any regrets from it, and I see it as, well, back to that sword analogy. It was the battle testing. I mean, it was the intense moments that eventually defined and forged who I am now. And there's some of it that I would love to have not experienced.
Sure. Yeah,
Me
too.
Yeah. And also, I don't know who I would be if I hadn't done that. And for this season, probably the first time in my life, I'm pretty excited about who I am and who God has made me to be. So I'm okay with the journey that got me here.
Yeah, it's like that moment of integration, where you can pull in all of the experiences and recognize how they've kind of crafted the person.
Yes.
And almost kind of be grateful to be who you are.
Yes. Yeah, there's a sense of wholeness that comes from recognizing all of our spaces and all of our history and all of our present and all of our emotion.
Sure.
All of our fear and all of our passion, and seeing those sit comfortably in one person.
From this vantage point, if you could circle back around and talk to the 30-year-old or the 20-year-old or the teen Laura Beth version of yourself, what advice or what would you say to overcome the shame?
Yeah, it's something I tell myself frequently still. It's what I call the myth of permanence. What is happening right now isn't what's always going to be.
Mm.
I think we get caught up so much in the moment that the person that's rejecting us, the pastor that's preaching, the mob that's rallying against our people, whatever the context, it's hard to think to a place where that doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Where that's not the dominant voice, where that's not, and it's hard to remember a time
Sure.
when that didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the concept of from the scriptures that says tomorrow's a new day. Every day is made brand new.
Sure.
And while we might not see major changes, we might wake up with the same financial crisis that we went to sleep with. We might wake up in the same house with the same people that are damaging to us. Every day gives an opportunity for a new perspective and for a new change, be it small or big or whatever. So, just hanging on to hope, hanging on to that sense that tomorrow has the potential to be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm reading a book right now by David White, who's a beautiful poet. It's called Crossing the Unknown Sea. It's incredible. But he says, when I was trying to leave corporate America and become a professional poet, I decided to do one thing every day. And at the end of the year, that would be 365 things I did to make my dream come true. And I just love that perspective that evolution and change and growth happens on the daily, and to have the patience for it.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I'm fighting right now is everything I do has a sense of urgency.
Mm-hmm.
I feel, and this is somewhat because I've seen the families endure the suicides of their LGBTQ kids or siblings or whatever. I've seen the churches continue to preach against him and do damage to the community. I've seen the politics and the legislation and all of this. And they're giving myself permission to be patient
Mm-hmm.
and to let the changes happen, so to allow those 365 changes to accumulate over a year and not to have to accomplish them in a week.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is something that I'm constantly having to battle in my own head. I want things better, and I want them better now.
Right.
I figured it out. Why couldn't everybody else? But that's not realistic. That's not fair and not healthy. So
yeah, for sure. Nice. I'm gonna pivot us, if that's okay.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
To some identity formation questions.
Okay.
What does it mean when you call yourself a Christian?
What do you mean when I call myself a Christian? Okay, you're tapping into every seminary class I've taken in the last year.
So, I realize.
To me, to be a Christian is to walk in the way of Christ.
Well said.
And that's changed dramatically in the last 2 years.
What does it mean to you today?
It is that. I mean, it is to understand Christ's message of compassion and inclusion, and the efforts that he went to create space around him for those who had not had space created for them. I think before it had more to do with religion than life. It had more to do with conforming to a church, to adopting all of the right creeds and confessions, and saying the right prayers at the right times, and um, yeah, and I've made a lot more room, I think, in my concept of what it is to be Christian. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ask me again next year.
Oh,
We'll see. And see how that.
Yeah, for sure. Yes. Do I have you back? I think I lost you for a little bit.
Yes, had a little bit of a.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
There we go. Cool. All right. What does it mean to be LGBTQ plus in your family, church, or your community?
Also, something that's changing a lot. In some contexts, it means that I approach life from a slightly different perspective. As a trans woman who was socialized male for most of my life, and as an intersex woman who has a curious anatomy, it means that I have a unique take on my life and the world around me and the perspectives. And we were talking earlier about communities, but the communities that I am engaging in are communities that celebrate and honor that perspective. In the context of my family, my family of origin, it's a challenge. It's different. It's something that they have to work at understanding, and something that's taken a lot of patience on all of our parts to grow into that. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Sure.
With that, with my family, with my kids, and it's liberating. My expression as an LGBTQ Christian has given them permission to express themselves and to explore their faith and explore their identity and everything. So there's not a single answer to that.
Right.
It's a complex question that takes a lot of time and focus and compassion and love and energy on my part, as well as the part of those around me. So
one of the things that you're kind of alluding to that I'm kind of picking up is that identity is evolving.
It is, and I hope it never stops. I have a picture that circulates. Somebody asked me early in my transition, like, you need to do a before and after picture. And at first I was like, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then it occurred to me, I was like, when's after?
Sure. That's a good point.
Is it once my hair got to a certain length? Is it, after surgeries? Is it after, what constitutes the completion of this evolution of me as a trans woman? And there isn't one. So the picture actually is a grid of about 9 pictures, starting with me in high school and showing the evolution of another friend will describe it as a study in trans hairstyles, but it's just this evolution, and the final picture, and they are all labeled before. The final picture is just a question mark.
Sure.
It's like, where's it going? I don't know.
Sure.
And I hope it keeps evolving.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the permission to evolve is a lot of that security and safety.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. How do you show up as a Christian and a trans woman in secular spaces?
I've been working for this the last year under this, what I call the assumption of acceptance. And basically that says I'm going to go into a space, whether it is as a trans woman into Christian spaces or as a Christian into secular LGBTQ spaces, with the assumption that people are going to accept me. Now, there's all sorts of safety precautions and awareness that not just LGBTQ people, but people of color and women, and we all need to be aware of as we're out in those environments. But the assumption is that people are going to accept me, and I'm going to put them in the position of coming out otherwise.
Sounds very mutual.
It's leveling the playing field.
Gracious, yeah.
A little bit to me. And so in a more emotional moment, I might say, I've done all the coming out I'm going to do. It's your turn. If you have an issue with this as a Christian, with me as an LGBTQ person as a Christian, or with me as a Christian in a secular context, if there are conflicts there, you need to put those on the table. Or you can wrestle with them. You don't have to put them on the table.
Sure.
But I will recognize them as your conflicts and not mine. And
Laura Beth, what a healthy boundary.
Yeah, it frees me up to have conversations that I realized I hadn't prior to that.
Yeah. I love the way that you can...
Did I lose you again?
Oh, I'm not sure. Am I there?
You're back.
Okay,
Gotcha.
Great. I don't know if you heard this, but I was just saying, what a beautiful boundary that you're holding. That whatever's happening outside of, I like to think of it as a snow globe or like a hazmat suit. But my boundary lets me live in this snow globe where my environment isn't shifted by your opinions of me. And it's really cool to hear you kind of create this beautiful confidence of your internal reality, this snow globe, and whatever's happening outside of it, that you don't take responsibility for it.
Yes. Yeah. And I think there is, I like the idea of the hazmat suit because there are valves and there are interactions that I control
Right.
on the suit that, so as I go through these seminary courses and as I meet people from different faith traditions and different religions and different sexual orientations and gender identities, then I have room to let those things in. I'm not, my identity, like you say, it is evolving. And so I'm not completely isolated in that context, nor do I want to be.
For sure.
However, those boundaries exist, and in counseling terms, they often will say these are boundaries, not barriers.
Right.
A boundary is porous. You can move in and out of it, but it's an understanding of where the limits are. And so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. We're kind of leading into that last question. But what prejudices do you perceive as an LGBTQ Christian, and how do those impact your personal identity? And this is a very different question when we're standing inside a hazmat suit.
So repeat the question. You broke up just a little bit.
Sorry.
Okay.
What prejudices do you perceive as an LGBTQ Christian, and how does this impact your personal identity?
I think the prejudices come from the concept, the notion that there are standards that are so-called God ordained that we are breaking. And that as we engage in our self-understanding and our self-awareness, that we are somehow offensive to God and the system that has been created in God's name. So whether those are from a Christian perspective or a secular perspective, this culture that we have in the United States, in Western culture, has been so greatly influenced by Judeo-Christian values that, you know, the affront to those values is perceived as affecting the whole culture. And so, you know, my conversations about them tend to move somewhat more toward facts. Having an intersex diagnosis has proven very valuable in those conversations because my very body points to the limitless expression of God's creation and creativity. And, you know, sometimes that evolves into a conversation about sin and original sin and how it impacts our bodies. And so their argument then that my body is a mistake comes back to God's work in creation and all these places. And all of those conversations just take time, and they take some creative patience to engage in them.
Right.
And it's not something that I'm always there for.
Sure.
And it's not something that every LGBTQ Christian is going to be called and equipped to be there for. And there should be no shame in the fact that they're not engaging in those conversations.
Yeah. You know, I think that these conversations are made easier when we're in our hazmat suit, but we're not designed to live our whole entire lives in a hazmat suit.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that's why one thing I love about the boundaries versus barriers language is that my boundaries exist and they're healthy, and I don't take them away when I go into these situations and these conversations. But I do allow things to move in and about and around them that make them more challenging sometimes to hold on to. So.
For sure. Yeah.
Necessarily answered your last question very helpfully.
No, that's great. No, I loved it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for including me, and look forward to seeing you guys in Fort Lauderdale.
Absolutely. Yeah, me too. Woohoo.